Hello and welcome to Idaho Bigfoot. I'm your host, Jep. Today I'm joined by my lovely assistant, Ushi, or Ushi Bear. So in this video, we will discuss how tall Sasquatch are, or would likely be, the square cube law, food resources being a factor in Bigfoot's height, how heavy Sasquatches get, again, a big Sasquatch's body weight, and this is the key, and the amount of foot traffic it would create. Let's see here. Body heat being a limiting factor. That's actually a pretty big one. The fact that no creature that big, and when I say that big, I'm referring to the 20-foot tall Bigfoot in this thumbnail made for me by Jamel with Aloe Arts. We have a 20-foot tall Bigfoot in the frame, as well as a 13-footer, which is what we're going to be discussing today, and basically anything in between those heights. So the fact that no creature that big on land is difficult to find, and the inability of a massive Sasquatch to effectively hide, the lack of skeletal evidence and what it means, the amount of poop a Sasquatch would create and what it means, the size of their feet, the mammoth mastodon Sasquatch connection, and how Mammuthus exilis, aka the pygmy or the Channel Island mammoth, disproves the claims that Bigfoot must be huge. Now, before we dive in, I would like to ask all of you to please remember to click like on this video and to please click the share button down below, copy the link, and share it wherever you feel it's appropriate. If there's a Facebook page about Bigfoot that you feel like this would go well on, please share it, or on a forum or something, wherever you like, or share it to someone specifically. Please click subscribe for more of this content. It is free, and if you could please let a short ad play during one of the ad allotments. I try to only let a few play through the video. If you could just play one of those short ones, just let it play all the way through. If you could mute it, go get yourself some coffee or something, that would be fantastic. If you can't, that's fine. You can also donate a couple dollars to me via my Buy Me a Coffee link down below. $1, $5, whatever it is, goes a long way to help support the channel. I think I set the coffee price at $3, and I've had some very kind people donate to me through there. I greatly appreciate your support. So thank you all very much, and let's dive in. How tall are Bigfoot? If Bigfoot are real, then this is an important point. It helps all other pieces of speculation fall into place, potentially helping it be more accurate. I feel that understanding how big they theoretically get helps to narrow down what they are and helps answer questions about why we don't find more evidence for their existence. I feel that understanding how big they theoretically get helps to narrow down what they are and helps answer questions about why we don't find more evidence for their existence. And as you saw there with the bullet-pointed list, there will be more about that tidbit at the end. But let's start by narrowing down what most people report. According to Raincoat Sasquatch, written by J. Robert Alley, quote, "There persists among some Southeast Alaskan locals the notion that most modern Southeast Alaskan reports of Sasquatches describe man-sized creatures, and that this is somehow related to the description of the hair-covered Kushtaka of Tlingit folk belief. While the latter is an undisputed fact of ethnographic anthropology, the thought that Sasquatches are man-sized is entirely unsupported by the database of reports. Southeast Alaskans of the older generation are quite familiar with the term Kushtaka, or wild man, but do not usually associate Kushtaka stories with Sasquatches. For them, the Kushtaka has definite connotations with native belief in the supernatural. Many younger residents are of families emigrated from the lower 48 states and are not familiar with the term Kushtaka at all. Since silence surrounds the telling of the older stories, there is an aura of disbelief, ridicule, and occasionally humor regarding any recent reports of Sasquatch-like creatures in the vast archipelago that makes up Southeast Alaska. Overall, reported heights present a bell-shaped curve of statures with a mean height of something close to 7 feet. This is exactly what one would expect. This is exactly what one would expect with differences in age and gender of the creatures. And the lesser frequency of 5-foot and also 8 or 9-foot reports seems to correspond well with projected heights for juvenile and adult male Sasquatches. Now, when he said, "The thought that Sasquatches are man-sized is entirely unsupported by the database of reports," he must have been thinking only about adult Bigfoot, As he later states, the lesser frequency of 5-foot and also 8 or 9-foot reports seems to correspond well with projected heights of juvenile and adult male Sasquatches. He did not say that there were no reports of 5-foot tall Bigfoot. He implied that there just aren't many, as he also did with the 8 and 9-foot tall Sasquatch reports. A 5-foot tall Bigfoot is squarely within the range of human height, juvenile or otherwise. Now, in Appendix 1, under the title Field Guide to the Pacific Coastal Sasquatch, he describes their height as such. Adult males are 7 to 9.5 feet, occasionally larger, averaging 7.5 to almost 8 feet. Females, 6 to 7.5 feet, adolescents, 6 to 7 feet. The simple fact is this. He stated that there in Alaska, where people are used to seeing large creatures, that people consistently estimate the height of the Sasquatch they saw as being about 7 feet in height. Less cases indicate the height of 8 or 9 feet. This is Alaska, the one place where a Bigfoot could realistically be huge, and yet they typically aren't reported as being big. Now, the argument I feel he is making is that the younger ones are less wary and have a harder time hiding from people, and that a height of 9 feet is attained for adults commonly enough, but they just aren't seen so often. If I'm right in my interpretation, then I must say that said logic does not line up for me. Generally speaking, for most mammals, the older you are, the more ballsy you get, especially if you are big and tough. And the bigger you are, the harder it is to hide. The older you are, the less your senses work. So a smaller, more timid Bigfoot with senses that are theoretically sharper would have a higher likelihood of hiding. Now, I feel like this is an important point to make here. Alaska does have some large animals with the Alaskan moose, polar bear, and Kodiak brown bear, and really just the coastal brown bear that lives there. Now, most of the United States does not have big animals, except with cattle, the American elk, American bison, grizzly bears, and moose. And you might think that is a fairly stacked list. However, think about how common some of those animals are. With the American bison, the grizzly bear, and the moose, you really don't find them everywhere. With the moose, for example, when you do find them, they're a lot smaller than the ones up in Canada and Alaska. Here is a wonderful size comparison made by Tanner Streeter. You can find him on Instagram. He does a great job. He also does taxidermy, so if you're in his area and you're into that, check him out. But this was very nice of him to let me use the image. He did a great size comparison showing the size difference between the different subspecies of moose. And as you can see here, the ones that we have here in Idaho, the Shiras moose is quite a bit smaller than the Alaskan moose. And I feel like this is an important point to make. Even when you do find some of these species in the United States, they really aren't that big compared to the ones that you have in Alaska. And that's for a number of different reasons. And we'll get into that. And that's not always a hard fact, as we'll see later, but it is something that you do see at times. And the moose is a great example of that. Same with the grizzly bear. We find them in parts of Idaho and Wyoming and predominantly in Montana. And what you see is a 600, maybe 700 pound bear for a full grown adult. And even some black bears have reached that 600 pound weight mark. Although rare, it has happened. So you're not looking at a massive bear, but when you get up to Alaska, you'll see bears going past 1,000 pounds. And so you're looking at something quite a bit larger. I think one of them reached 1,500, but don't quote me on that. But anyway, with bears, you do see them get quite a bit larger up in Alaska, at least on the coastline. And that is where a fair bit of Bigfoot sightings have occurred. Now you may go, well, there you go. Bigfoot and bears, they're the same thing. There you go. We'll get into that later as well, but I must say I disagree and I have my reasons. But at the end of the day, it is true that some of these Bigfoot reports do come from the areas where you do see those big brown bears. But what's interesting is that these guys aren't estimating massive sizes for most of these Bigfoot. They're saying that they're actually smaller. And that makes a lot of sense to me because you're looking at animals that fit a slightly different niche in the biological area, in the ecology of the area. You're not looking at something that competes head to head because in that case, you'd find one species being far more common than the other in certain spots and localized areas, and that's not something you really see here. You see bears being a very common species along the coastline. So if Bigfoot live there, they aren't going to compete head-to-head with them. There might be some slight overlap, but they aren't going to be the exact same creature. And given part of the reason why these bears get so big is because they live on the coast and eat the diet that they do, it makes sense that the Bigfoot would not be competing with them head-to-head as much and would be eating a slightly different diet, and they're therefore maybe not growing quite as big. And a lot of these guys see these large sizes in animals on a regular basis, get good at estimating their size, and likely be more accurate than someone from the lower 48 that just isn't used to seeing much more than elk or cattle, which can get fairly large, but again, they aren't massive like some of those moose and bears get up in Alaska. And another interesting point is that up in Alaska, when it comes to moose, you have to be able to estimate how big it is for you to be able to shoot it and take it. And so guys up in Alaska have to get good at estimating the size of animals. And right here in this excellent piece illustrated for me by Jamel with Aloe Arts, you can see just how big these creatures are. Here we have a 6'2" human male, and then we have an 8-foot tall male Bigfoot, a 13-foot tall male Bigfoot, a 13-foot tall bull elephant, and a massive 20-foot tall male Bigfoot. Now the 20-footer may not be exactly 20 feet, neither may any of the others, but I think I got their sizes just right, and Jamel did as well. I think the 20-footer might just be slightly shorter, but it's really not that far off. It was just constraint as far as fitting it in the frame of the image. We had a little bit of trouble with that, but honestly, he did a fantastic job, and it's very, very close. So if it isn't exactly right, it is very, very close to being right. But I just wanted to put that little disclaimer out there. But as you can see, when you're looking at the 13-footer, it's as wide at the shoulders as the bull elephant is at its widest point. And then when you look at the 20-foot tall Bigfoot, its hip, its pelvis, is as wide as that bull elephant. And its shoulders are even wider. And just think about how huge that is. The bones on that 20-footer especially would rival small sauropods in size. Really, when you're looking at this 20-foot tall Bigfoot, it's hard to imagine that its bones would not be preserved, and there is no way you could ever confuse its bones for being anything else. But for that 8-footer, or a 7-footer, 6.5-footer, you could, and that's something we'll get into later. I feel like you aren't going to get much more than 8.5 or 9 feet in height for the lucky old males. The ones that have lived a safe life, a healthy life, have had plenty of food, and even then, I feel like that's the upper limit of their genetic capability. It's kind of like professional basketball players and the guys that get that tall. Yes, they exist, but when you look at it, they're in prime conditions and situations to be able to get that big, and they're really quite a small percentage of the population that does get that big. It's at the upper limit of our genetic capabilities. I think that's exactly what you'd find for some of these massive Bigfoot. I do not believe that they'd be common. So hopefully that makes sense. And with that, we'll have to move on to our next segment. The square cube law. With the claims of Bigfoot's height, there comes the square cube law. The square cube law is basically, according to this Reddit user on the Ask Science subreddit, is, quote, the idea that if something is made bigger by some ratio, the cross-sectional area increases as the square of the ratio, but its weight increases by the cube of the ratio. So the ability of the thing to support its own weight gets worse as it gets bigger. I thought that was a very nice little explanation there. So shout out to him. Now the square cube law is often referenced as an explanation as to why Bigfoot get large in northern areas. Now the actual name for this is Bergmann's law, where he posited that animals grow in size in northern areas, so the amount of surface area on their body goes down and their heat is retained better, allowing them to survive cold weather better. The smaller you are, the more surface area is exposed to the environment, causing your body to be less resistant to the weather, at least in theory. According to an article titled Relationships Between Temperature and Animal Sizes Has Been Clarified, posted on the University of Texas at Austin's website, quote, Bergmann's rule states that colder climates spawn bigger bodies because they help retain heat, while smaller bodies help shed it. As a result, a polar bear is more than 2.5 times as tall at the shoulder as a sun bear from equatorial regions. Allen's rule deals with extremities, such as limbs, ears, and beaks, stating that animals in colder climates tend to have smaller extremities because extremities tend to have more surface than volume and are uniquely suited to shed heat. For example, Arctic hares have evolved short legs and ears, whereas desert jackrabbits have evolved very long legs and ears. The problem is that everything we know about ecology tells us that changing the size of bodies and extremities can be problematic, said Carlos Botero, an associate professor of integrative biology at UT Austin and the lead author on the paper. For example, if body size decreases, birds may not be able to hunt the same food as their ancestors. Similarly, if the average size or shape of a bill changes, birds may become less efficient foragers or have trouble producing typical mating calls. It's not surprising that major studies have failed to find evidence for these predictions, and that these so-called biological rules are currently controversial. The new study could clarify that debate by showing that, although the patterns that biologist Carl Bergmann and zoologist Joel Asaph Allen predicted occur in the wild, the two separate mechanisms complement each other within avian lineages. The study's researchers also wanted to figure out why a small number of bird families still follow the rules that most others appear to circumvent. They found that in many of those cases, the species involved had bumped up against some kind of natural constraint. For example, owls have responded to temperature gradients primarily through body size adjustments, such that the Arctic great gray owl has a body nearly 2 feet long, whereas its relative, the Central American pygmy owl, which lives in the tropics, is only about 5 inches long. These birds, however, have highly specialized beaks that are almost the same size. When your hunting tactics depend on the size and shape of your beak, that structure is the last thing you want to change, said Justin Baldwin, a graduate student of Botero's at Washington University in St. Louis and first author on the paper. As a result, it is likely less problematic to only change body size instead. Another example involves flycatchers. The tufted tit tyrant flycatcher lives in the coldest parts of South America and has a tiny beak, which helps it retain heat. Its cousin, the boat-billed flycatcher, has a comparatively massive bill and lives in warmer areas of the tropics. Both have diminutive body sizes. When you're already really small and you need to shed heat, it may be hard to get any smaller, so the next best available option is to expand the bill, Baldwin said. So what does this mean? Well, basically there are restrictions on Bergmann's rule. It's not an absolute law, it has restrictions, and every species will have its own specific limitations and restrictions. So, although the square cube law, and specifically Bergmann's rule, does come into effect, it is counterbalanced by biological constraints. If enough food cannot be found consistently, then any case of a Bigfoot being extraordinarily tall is a fluke, possibly caused by an imbalance with the pituitary gland, specifically hypertrophy of the pituitary gland like what Robert Wadlow experienced. Now, the life expectancy of such a creature would be very low, and it may not even survive childhood. There is little to no care in cold, dark forests. And this is a point that I've brought out before. I highly doubt that Bigfoot has a very good birth rate. And that's partly why we don't have so many reports of them. It's not just, genetics, it's hard to find a mate and that sort of thing, which, could very well be. But when you look at the birth canal of a human, because we have upright walking capabilities, we have impeded the ability to give birth very easily. So this is something I've talked about before in my past videos, but basically what happens is you need more help from others to help give birth to your baby, whereas with chimps, they don't really need as much help, or gorillas. The way their pelvis is shaped, it allows the baby to come out more easily, whereas with a human, not so. And in fact, many women have died in childbirth. Now, that doesn't mean that having children is not okay. That doesn't mean that you shouldn't try it or anything. But what it does mean is that, you may need help. But a Bigfoot doesn't have that, more than likely. And so that's the point. When you're looking at a Bigfoot here, the ability for them to give birth and to reproduce may have been heavily impeded by their ability to walk upright. And that may be why we don't see widespread evidence of them, is just because not only does genetics play a part, but also just their physicality impedes their ability to give birth easily. I've always felt that they are loners. very few cases indicate a group that lives together. Most sighting reports are of individual creatures. Now, of course, people will be quick to point out that you can't just trust eyewitness encounters, but at the same time you can. It's just that you have to take them with a grain of salt. So people will say, well, maybe the one that the people saw was kind of a guard. It was trying to gather their attention so they wouldn't see the family group. Okay, but there are far too many questions and answers with the idea that Bigfoot lives in a group. Food resources immediately becomes more difficult to account for. There's a lot of issues with foot traffic, avoiding trail cameras, avoiding hunters. It all becomes more difficult when you're living in a group. People can come up with some sort of idea of how well, maybe they all work together to try and, but at the end of the day, I feel like the simplest answer is the most accurate, and that is that they are loners. And this would make so much sense, in my opinion. And that's something that I want to go into in a future video. I have another couple of videos I want to make before that, but you guys let me know if that's something that you really want to see me talk about, then I'll push that one ahead. But I'm thinking it'll have to wait a little bit, but I honestly, just giving you the bare bones opinion here, I do not believe that they live in a group. I believe that you'll find a mother and child, and I do believe that, it's possible that occasionally the male may find them and visit them and see if they're okay. Tigers do the same thing, so a primate being willing to do that wouldn't seem out of place to me. Maybe bring them a meal and just kind of walk around his territory, visiting the females in the area. But even then, I don't know. It's all speculation, but I feel like the simplest answer is the most likely here, taking the opinion that Bigfoot are loners is the easiest, it's the simplest, it makes the most sense to me, and until I see really solid evidence that shows that you'll find groups of these things living together, I'm sticking with my opinion here. That's just me. If you guys have had a sighting that indicated otherwise, let me know. But most people have not, and I feel like that's quite an important point. But, if you are all alone out there trying to give birth, you don't have a very high likelihood of that baby surviving. And that's not only from, illness, because a baby doesn't really have an immune system, right? It's trying to develop that while staying alive. And one of the reasons why we had such horrible birth rates and, survivability rates in this country was from a lack of hygiene. There were a few things that kind of coincided at the same time. And one of those things that I remember hearing was that, medicine's the reason why we've gotten rid of some of these diseases. Well, what people don't factor in is the fact that people had very little hygiene. The guy who first talked about, maybe we should wash our hands before handling babies. If we just handled a dead body or was just doing surgery on someone, maybe we should wash our hands before touching a baby, was kind of mocked and ridiculed at the time. Kind of that posturing, laughing ridiculousness that people do. But he turned out to be right. And because of his practices being implemented, hygiene started to go up. We finally had a structure from being able to clean water and being able to clean our hands using that water and soap and being able to keep ourselves clean. It's from hygiene that we've had better health above all else. And so out in the woods, you do not have that kind of hygiene. Not really. I mean, unless you're by a body of water and you're washing your hands constantly or something. There are some animals that are very clean comparatively, like raccoons and stuff, but most animals are not. Bigfoot could be, but that's all speculation. So anyway, let's move on with the next point. Food resources. The reason Kodiak brown bears were and are able to grow to such large sizes is because of an abundance of food, specifically salmon. Feeding on the annual runs of multiple species of salmon, as well as eating whatever can be found on the coast, and scavenging from other predators and eating the game animals that are around. I don't know if they have elk up there. I know that the adjacent island to Kodiak Island does have elk, which was really interesting to me. I just watched the Meat Eater episode on that. So As far as the actual game species that live there, I'm not 100% on exactly what. I'd love to go there someday if I could guarantee my safety. That's kind of iffy. Anyway, in northern environments where people claim Bigfoot lives, such runs of salmon are not common. There are larger species like moose, northern caribou, and in some areas white-tailed deer, though. However, the grizzlies that live in those same areas are not as big as you think. In the book The Great Bear Almanac by Gary Brown, quote, weights of bears vary between species, with polar bears and Alaskan brown bears more than 10 times heavier than sun bears. Such differences between species, though due in part to genetics, are most often a result of variations in habitat, primarily diet. For example, the Alaskan brown bears of the coastal regions of North America, with a major source of fish and more lush vegetation, are nearly twice the weight of the inland brown bears or grizzly bears. Causes of individual weight differences between bears of the same species and sometimes the same habitat may include individual health, age, the sex of the bear, individual ability to locate food or digest specific foods, and the level of ability to withstand human impacts in the habitat. Seasonal fluctuations in weights of individual bears is common. Fall, pre-denning, weights are normally much greater than spring, emergence weights. Weights are affected by seasonally available foods. American black bears of eastern North America are consistently larger than those of western states. Weights are averages from a specific sampling. In New York, an adult male is about 273 pounds, an adult female 196 pounds. In California, adult male is 216 pounds, an adult female about 127 pounds. Wyoming and Montana grizzly bears are larger than those of the Yukon Territory. Again, weights are averages from a specific sampling. In Wyoming, an adult male is about 539 pounds and an adult female about 334 pounds. Whereas in the Yukon Territory, an adult male is about 315 pounds and an adult female about 209 pounds. Bear weights are obtained when bears are harvested during a hunt, when illegally killed or poached, and when immobilized for management and research. The weights below from some states and provinces are dressed weights of bears harvested by hunters or taken during management actions. Weights of mature males. Brown bear, average 725 pounds, range 500 to 900 pounds, heaviest recorded 2,500 pounds. Grizzly bear, average 490 pounds, range 350 to 700 pounds, heaviest recorded 1,496 pounds. Now, these numbers aren't exactly absolute, but they do illustrate an important point. You can only get big when you have the food resources to do so. You cannot create something from nothing. Arguably, the whistling marmot kind of gets around this for winter. According to Life Above the Timberline by Gene George in the book Marvels and Mysteries of Our Animal World, quote, the marmot is one of the most surprising. It is a hibernator. Most hibernators need long springs, summers, and autumns to store up food. However, the whistling marmot, who in his high-altitude home actually does whistle, has only 2.5 months at the most to get fat for winter. For a long time, it was believed his secret was to eat from dawn to dusk without stopping. But on a camping trip to the high country, I watched a marmot who spent most of his day running in and out of his den. He was seldom in his meadow feeding. I asked a mammologist who was with us what he made of this idleness, and he told me that the remarkable secret of the marmot's survival in the mountains is the animal's unique metabolism. All of a sudden, toward the end of the season, these fellows can put on layers of fat in no time at all, on no more food than usual. However, I must state that this is an apples to oranges comparison. They only put on weight for a limited time. They are also much, much smaller than a 13 to 20 foot tall Sasquatch. Plus, they are able to survive on a fair amount of food. The coastal brown bears eat much salmon. The annual salmon runs are practically free food. Supplement that with anything that washes ashore, like beached whales or any seals that are within reach, mollusks, crabs, and whatever you can think of. Foraging is a lot easier on the coast than it is inland. All right, guys, we are back inside the house today, and I wanted to re-record this portion of the video. What you were about to see was me using estimates for how much a 13-foot tall Bigfoot and a 20-foot tall Bigfoot would eat in a day, and how much an 8-foot tall Bigfoot would eat as well. Now, all the numbers that I had estimated came from the video, How Much Food Does Sasquatch Need to Eat? Carnivore, Omnivore, and Herbivore Diets. It was episode 12 on this channel, and I thought I had done really well with it. And so I just used those numbers in this video, popped them into the script, and came up with all the estimates based off of those numbers. Unfortunately, they were bad numbers, at least for the omnivores and carnivores. It does seem like the herbivore numbers changed a little bit, but I wasn't really concerned with comparing them just for the sake of re-recording this, because I've been sitting on this video for a while trying to edit it, and I wanted to get it out. So, but I do know that for carnivores and omnivores, the numbers were skewed. They were off. In reality, the numbers were lower than what I made them seem in the video originally. And I didn't even really think of it as a problem because I hadn't really thought about it very much until my mom, who was watching the video for me, because she does that. Shout out to her, by the way. She's watching right now. I need someone to listen to my videos, because after months of editing, I can't hear my own voice anymore and notice anything. I start to tune it out. So I need someone to listen to it, watch it, and make sure everything's good. And oftentimes there are a lot of little errors that I missed. I'll get the big ones because I stand out, but the little ones, they just blend right in for me. And so this was one of those errors that was actually kind of bigger, but I didn't notice it. And that was just because I assumed that I'd done a good job, A, and B, I thought that, well, carnivores, they do gorge themselves in a day, but here's what I did. When it came to like tigers and lions, right, upper estimates for how much they'll eat is about 80-something pounds of meat a day. At least it seemed like they were trying to say a day. I thought, wow, but that's a big cat, 400, almost 500 pounds, yeah, I could see them eating that much, Well, the problem is that, and I kind of recognized this in the video and in this video when I first recorded it, but didn't really click. These carnivores will have feast and famine. They'll kill something maybe once a week. Sometimes they won't kill something for like 2 weeks at a time, and they'll be starving in that time period. Fasting, but optimally they'll kill something once, maybe twice a week, and when they do, they'll gorge themselves. Like, they will gorge themselves on the meat. And taking those estimates for a maximum of 2 times per week eating, and assuming that it means every single day of its life, is wrong. And I didn't even really recognize it at the time. I do now, and that's why I'm making this clear. Unfortunately, when you're trying to find resources, even in good books, like, it's not something people really talk about. And I think it's because it can be a little iffy. It's all about the individual animal's metabolism. As I'd imagine they're like us, where some of us have great metabolism, some of us have bad metabolism. I think it's just one of those things where each individual is going to have a different bodily system, which means that they're going to differ in diet a little bit. I think you can generalize just like you can with humans, and that's what I've attempted to do, but it's a little difficult. And not everyone's interested in how much food a lion eats in a day or needs to eat in a day. So it was a little iffy. I did find some good sources, though, by the way, but I redid everything for the herbivores as well. And when it comes to all these different animals, I mean, there's numbers that they'll eat in a day to maintain their body weight, and there's numbers that they'll eat in a day because it's once or twice a week, and they're just gorging themselves. Or for bears, like grizzly bears, for example, they'll eat upwards of 60 pounds a day. Some estimates showed 90 pounds of food a day, trying to gain weight. They're trying to become obese, so that way when they go into hibernation, they have fat reserves to use. Well, it also helps to insulate themselves too, but that's kind of a secondary thing, I think. Anyway, just trying to sustain themselves, they'll eat maybe 30 pounds of food a day. That's a big difference. So anyway, in order to basically summarize everything here, I calculated that carnivores consumed an average of 4.236% of their body weight a day to maintain their body weight, again, with a median of 4.24. Omnivores consume the average of 5.828% of their body weight with a median of 6, and herbivores consume the average of 5.132% of their body weight with a median of 3.10. So I used those numbers for these next estimates that I will give you, and the body weight estimates will be in the next segment, and that's where I came up with these numbers for how much a Bigfoot would weigh, the low and the high weight estimate. However, I need to use them here with this segment, so slight spoilers here, but anyway, most people will probably skip the next segment. So for a 13-foot tall or 3.96 meter tall Bigfoot, you're looking at an average low weight estimate of 1,193 pounds or 541.135 kilograms, or an average high weight estimate of 5,272 pounds or 2,391.339 kilograms. So 1,000 pounds versus 5,000 pounds, bit of a difference. The high weight estimates, in this case 5,000 pounds, is probably more accurate, and I'll tell you why in the next segment. So anyway, food intake of a carnivore, it would be eating 50.535 pounds or 22.92 kilograms on the low end, 223.32 pounds or 101.296 kilograms on the high end. If an omnivore, it would be eating 69.528 pounds or 31.537 kilograms on the low end, up to 307.25 pounds or 139.366 kilograms on the high end. Food intake of herbivore would be 61.22 pounds or 27.768 kilograms on the low end to 270.559 pounds or 122.72 kilograms on the high end. If I misread any of this, I apologize, but the numbers will be on screen for those watching. So, roughly 50 to 70 pounds of food to 223 to about 307 pounds of food. I mean, for 1,000 pounds and 5,000 pounds, I mean, that's a bit of a difference. I mean, the impact of the impact of an animal eating 307 pounds of food a day to sustain its body weight, nothing more, just sustain its body weight, is quite a lot, but you'll be impressed by the next few numbers, believe me. So, for the 20-foot tall or 6.096 meter tall Bigfoot, the average low weight estimate would be 5,802.12 pounds or 2,631.797 kilograms. The average high weight estimate is 23,200 pounds or 10,523.343 kilograms. The food intake if a carnivore would be 245.777 pounds or 111.48 kilograms on the low end, and 982.75 pounds or 445.767 kilograms on the high end. Food intake of omnivore would be 338.147 pounds or 153.38 kilograms on the low end, or 1,352.096 pounds or 613.30 kilograms on the high end. Food intake of herbivore would be 297.76 pounds or 135.06 kilograms on the low end, or 1,190.62 pounds or 540.056 kilograms on the high end. Whew, that's a little difficult to read out. So anyway, on the low end, you're looking at 245 pounds, almost 246, up to 1,352 pounds of food. Wow. Those don't exist. I know that's a ballsy thing to say for a lot of people, but I just don't see it. And you'll see why I say that as we go on, too, for some other reasons. But this is a huge one. And, I know people have, like the professor I either did talk about already or will talk about in the video. I did the interview with him now. And, he was a very nice, reasonable fellow. But he did say that he talked with a primatologist who, has done estimates for fun to see how much a Bigfoot would eat and just doesn't see them existing out here because of the impact on the environment. Well, I don't know what that I think it was a lady, but I can't say for sure. I don't know what that person's estimates were, but I think my estimates are pretty reasonable here. And, for a 800-pound Bigfoot, one that weighs 363 kilograms, you're looking at 33.88 pounds of food, or 15.367 kilograms a day for the carnivore, 46.62 pounds, or 21.146 kilograms a day for the omnivore, or 41.05 pounds, or 18.619 kilograms of food for the herbivore. For that, again, average sized, 7.5, 8 foot tall, 800-pound Bigfoot. That's much more reasonable. And you got to remember, that's a male Bigfoot. A female Bigfoot would be closer to about 6 foot, 6'5", somewhere right around there. So you're looking at something that would not be eating as much as that. You're not looking at something that far off. And this is a point that I had made originally, is that, biologists and anyone that's trying to keep track of the food resources in the area have to account for humans in most places. Everywhere you go, there are humans. There are some very remote areas in like Alberta, British Columbia, the Yukon, Northwest Territories, and places in Idaho that are, pretty remote. But everywhere you go in the lower 48, there's people. Okay, even the most remote spots, someone has been there, someone will be there again. Up in the more remote sections of Canada, there's likely been people, and there probably will be people there in the future. Alaska, same thing. I mean, it may not be heavy pressure, maybe only 1 or 2 people a year, maybe 1 or 2 people every 10 years, you name it, but there's going to be people. And it's a little difficult to keep an eye on the environment when it's so rugged and you don't have much infrastructure to move around and record things. You're going to have to work extremely hard to keep an eye on the environment. And although I would like to talk to someone who does do that for like Idaho Fish and Game, for example, or a university biologist, something, it's a little tricky doing interviews like this because I'm interested in Bigfoot. A lot of other people aren't. How do you broach that topic? I mean, I have a YouTube channel, Potlatch Productions, where I want to be putting interviews with intellectual people who are scholars interested in the sciences, who have jobs that are related to the sciences, so people can see what their life is like and get to know them better. I've done that already once with Dr. Chad Bootersea. I want to do that with more people. I think that would be fantastic, and then use some of that information for the Bigfoot stuff as well. I think that's reasonable, but it's kind of tough to do that. I'm finding a really difficult job finding info on a few things right now, and it's tough. Trying to find info on items, history, or trying to get stuff for videos like this is always difficult, especially if it has anything to do with Bigfoot, because now people are kind of looking at you suspiciously, like, why do you want to talk about Bigfoot? So it's difficult, but factually speaking, no biologist can perfectly pinpoint how much food is in an area exactly. They just can't. That's impossible. Now, you can keep an eye on what the animals in the area are eating. If you find their scat, if you have collars on them, you can track where they're going, find the food sources there. I mean, you can do a lot. When it comes to deer, I think they do a better job because they know how many hunters are killing deer every year. They're able to keep an eye on how many people are seeing them. You're able to do fairly accurate reporting on stuff like that. But when it comes to a lot of smaller animals, when it comes to all the different plant life out there, I mean, there's only so much you can do. So I don't feel like any biologist, anyone that's keeping an eye on the environment, can be very exact with their numbers. They have to keep things open. So if humans are eating like the apples in an area, the elderberries in an area, stuff like that, they have to account for that. There's going to be a discrepancy between what the animals are eating and what's out there if humans are eating stuff too. You got to add them in, or just kind of take them out of the equation and just set them aside and recognize that they're there. You got to do something. So we could be saying that Bigfoot activity is being lumped in with human stuff. It could be anything. No estimations are going to be perfect, mine or theirs. They're going to be more accurate probably, but still. So keep in mind that, the impact on the environment, especially if you're eating like 33 pounds of food a day for a carnivore, that's a lot, but at the same time, it's kind of not. That's not horrible. And keep in mind that if a Bigfoot does what every other predator does, and it's feast and famine, it could be just like with mountain lions. They'll kill about 52 deer a year, mule deer, and they will eat as much as they can over a 7-day period or more. And in winter, I believe someone said that on one of the websites I was looking at, how a biologist was keeping an eye on a mountain lion male that had killed an elk and was feasting on it, and it was able to do so for like 17 up to 19 days because it was an especially cold winter here in Idaho, and it was able to keep eating it because mountain lions don't like meat that's going rotten. They don't touch that, which I can respect. Unlike vultures and stuff, which I have a begrudging respect for because we need them, but anyway, they can eat off of an animal for a lot longer when it's cold out. Even though the meat will start to harden up and freeze, you can still eat it, I guess. I don't know. I'm glad I'm not an animal. But, if you're feasting and then kind of fasting, it would account for why you don't see a huge impact on the environment. I do want to put this out too. The temperature of the environment, again, if it's winter, you need more calories to stay warm. Fall, you're going to be doing that as well because it's starting to get cold and you need to amp up everything for winter. You look at Patty, I believe she was filmed in fall, and she has fat reserves on her back. I mean, she looks like me right now, actually, with the kind of chunky sides. Except she would have those for a reason. I don't. I need to get rid of them. But, if she was real and not just a guy in a suit, I mean, she was eating to prepare for some sort of winter, probably. Fat helps keep you warm. The creature's activity level will change depending upon the time of year. The available food in the region would impact these numbers as well. It may eat less per day if it's eating something that's more nutritious. And you got to remember that a pregnant animal or one that has, in this case for like mountain lions, has cubs, will kill more often than males. That's something they found. A male may only kill like once a week, whereas a female will kill twice a week, and she will eat and eat and eat. She's trying to feed the cubs, and she will lick every bit of meat off of the bones as possible. Typically a mountain lion will be able to eat, I think it said 70 to 75% of the carcass, getting all the meat and organs and stuff off of it. Well, a female mountain lion will try and get even more off of the bones than that. And you got to remember with Bigfoot, they can crack bones. So they can get to the marrow inside, and that's even more nutrition. And they, can just fully eat that animal. And with grizzlies and with wolves in the environment, I mean, broken bones and stuff really isn't a sign of Bigfoot unless you know what you're looking for. Because they'll do the same thing, they'll crunch the bones up. So, anyway, this is just being used as an illustrator. Just keep that in mind. This isn't going to be perfectly accurate, but I do believe these numbers have a lot of merit. I do believe that you can do a lot with these numbers. And, I look forward to putting these in my book someday and trying to get maybe some expert opinions on these animals, like for the lions and stuff, people who work at preserves, figuring out how much they tend to eat a day. Just trying to make sure everything is as accurate as possible. But hopefully you guys enjoyed that, and hopefully it was worth it for you guys. Sorry to interrupt the video, but I think it was worth it. Anyway, let's dive right back in. Here we go. How heavy are Sasquatch? Let's try to estimate the size of a massive Sasquatch. First off, let's look at the 20-foot tall behemoth. We will use two different methods to estimate the size. Now, I will warn you, I'm not the best at math, but I spent a lot of time on this, so please don't ridicule me. If I got anything wrong, just gently reprimand me in the comments. But I would like to hear your thoughts. If you want to try and calculate these numbers up for yourselves, please do so, and please share your results down below. I'm not 100% sure my estimates are accurate, but I think they are pretty darn close. So let's just move on here. For the first estimate, I used the model of a 5-foot tall human male who weighs a heavy 222.5 pounds of weight. Now this is very large, but let's just pretend he's incredibly muscular. We will come up with a more reasonable estimate in a minute. His BMI, and this is important for the next few estimates that we'll come up with, is an approximate 43.4. So for the first estimate, to create the 10-foot tall human male that we will use as our base here, we will take 222.5 times it by 2 to create 445.265 pounds. To then create the Bigfoot, we take 445.265 and times it by 2. And the reason I do that is because Dr. Grover Krantz said that a human male is about half the weight of a Bigfoot of the exact same height. So the Bigfoot is much more muscular and heavy set. So we're timesing by 2 in this case, but we'll also times by 8, and I'll try and explain that when we get there. But for now, let's just look at the timesing by 2 number. So when we do that to try and create the 10-foot tall Bigfoot, right, we get 890.53 pounds, or twice as much as that of a 10-foot tall human male. So we will take 890.53 and times it by 8, because when you double the height of something, you have to times the mass by 8. So when you do that, we get 7,124.24 pounds, or 3,231.50 kilograms for a 20-foot tall Sasquatch. Now, if we take the exact same initial estimate of 222.5 pounds, but we try to double the height and times the weight by 8 instead, which is probably more accurate, we get 1,780 pounds for the 10-foot tall human male. Taking 1,780 pounds and timesing it by 2, we get 3,560 pounds for the 10-foot tall Sasquatch. If we double the size and correspondingly times the weight by 8 again, we get a total of 28,480 pounds, or 12,918.311 kilograms. Now, if we use a less muscular, lighter male figure as the basis, that's more reasonable for the height of 5 feet. So instead of 222.5 pounds, 140 pounds. For a well-proportioned male, this is a little bit more reasonable. His BMI would be 27.3. We take 140 pounds and we'll times it by 2, which equals 280 pounds for the 10-foot tall human male. 280 times 2 equals 560 pounds for a male Sasquatch. So 560 pounds, timesing it by 8, we get 4,480 pounds, or 2,032.094 kilograms for a 20-foot tall male Sasquatch. Now, to once again create a larger number, which again I think is the most accurate, as we'll talk about in a minute, we'll take 140 and just times it by 8, so doubling the height, but timesing the mass by 8, we get 1,120 pounds for a 10-foot tall human male. So 1,120 times 2 equals 2,240 pounds for a 10-foot tall male Sasquatch. 2,240 times 8 equals 17,920 pounds, or 8,128.375 kilograms for a 20-foot tall male Sasquatch. So between the conservative estimates, we see 7,124.24 pounds and 4,480 pounds respectively. An average of the two is 5,802.12 pounds, or 2,631.797 kilograms. Now, between the liberal estimates, we see 28,480 pounds and 17,920 pounds respectively. An average between these two is 23,200 pounds, or 10,523.343 kilograms. What about a 13-foot tall Sasquatch? Well, instead of a 5-foot tall man, let's use a 6.5-foot tall man instead. We are using the same BMI numbers for this comparison. A 6.5-foot tall man that weighs a heavy 366 pounds has a BMI of 43.4. To create the 13-foot tall man, we will take 366 times it by 2, which equals 732 pounds. To create the 13-foot tall Bigfoot, we take 732 times it by 2, which equals 1,464 pounds, or 664.059 kilograms. Now, if instead we take 366 pounds and times it by 8, we get 2,928 pounds. 2,928 pounds times 2 equals 5,856 pounds, or 2,656.236 kilograms. A 6.5-foot tall man that weighs 230.5 pounds has a BMI of 27.3. To create the 13-foot tall man once again, we'll take 230.5 and times it by 2, which equals 461 pounds. To create the 13-foot tall Bigfoot, we take 461 times it by 2 and get 922 pounds, or 418.21 kilograms. If we take 230.5 and times it by 8, we get 1,844 pounds. 1,844 pounds times 2 equals 3,688 pounds, or 1,672.848 kilograms. So between the conservative estimates, we see 1,464 pounds and 922 pounds, respectively. And the average between these two is 1,193 pounds, or 541.135 kilograms. Between the liberal estimates, we see 6,856 pounds and 3,688 pounds, respectively. And the average between these two is 5,272 pounds, or 2,391.339 kilograms. Now, is one estimate for either the 13-foot tall or 20-foot tall Sasquatch more accurate than the other? Well, if we look at Mastodon myrophycus, a type of pachyderm, specifically an extinct genus of Gomphothere, it ranged throughout North America from the Pliocene or early Blancan period, 4 million years ago, to the early Pleistocene or early Irvingtonian, 1.2 million years ago. And now most of this info is from Wikipedia, so take it with a grain of salt, but it seems correct from a glance. Supposedly, Stegomastodon myrophycus stood at about 8.5 feet or 2.6 meters tall, with a weight around 4.7 tons, 5.2 US tons, or 11,464 pounds of weight. Now, the American mastodon, a much more popular pachyderm, would be about 8 to 10 foot tall at the shoulder and weighed about 8,000 to 10,000 pounds. And I forgot to get the conversion to the metric system on the page here, so it will be on screen for you though. In my eyes, a creature that could look down at either one of these pachyderms, as seen by the comparison piece Allo Arts made for me, would logically be heavier than either one of these pachyderms, despite the body shape and skeletal difference. So I do see those heavy weight estimates being much more accurate, and that means that the intake of food that they would need to eat would be much more accurate as well, which means that there's a whole lot more to the picture with the bigger Bigfoot than a lot of people think. Now lastly, let's estimate the body weight of the 8-foot tall Sasquatch. This isn't as difficult. If we use the 6'9" or 2.057 meter tall strongman Hafthor Julius Bjornsson as our basis at his natural weight of 409 pounds, or 185.519 kilograms, then take 409 pounds and divide it by his height of 6.75 feet, we get 60.59, and that rounds up to 61 pounds per foot. 61 times 8 feet equals 488 pounds. Now, if we times that by 2, then we get 976 pounds, or 442.706 kilograms. Now, a male mountain gorilla can weigh 430 pounds, or 195.044 kilograms at a height of 6 feet, or 1.828 meters. This calculates to just under a weight-to-height ratio of 72. 72 times 8 feet equals 576. If we increase the estimate by just 20% for fun, we get 691.2 pounds. And when you look at what Dr. Grover Krantz said, he said that for a Bigfoot of around this height, it would weigh about 800 pounds. So, that's not exactly scientific, but I figured I'd throw that out there. So, it should be noted, though, especially for those that believe that Bigfoot are Gigantopithecus, that another large ape, the gorilla again, has bones that are much heavier, much denser than our bones. According to the Dian Fossey, now it should be noted, specifically for those that believe that Bigfoot are Gigantopithecus, that another large ape, the gorilla, once again, has bones that are much denser than the bones of us humans. According to the Dian Fossey Gorilla Fund, quote, this contributes to their average weight, 300 to 450 pounds, being much higher than average human weight. The greater weight is due to non-human great apes having a high density of spongy bone, while humans do not. With less spongy bone, this increases our chance of breaks and fractures. However, the more weight makes non-human great apes less buoyant, leaving them unable to swim. Now, H. erectus also apparently had a higher bone density than us, but how much so and to what degree I do not know. Now, I can imagine that the denser the bones, the lower the likelihood they will degrade away before being found. But it's hard to say as it's all theoretical at this moment for me. A big Sasquatch's body weight and the amount of foot traffic it would create. When you travel along areas, you make a dent. A creature that is constantly being hit by tree branches would break them and waste much energy trying to resist their pull as it walks along and breaks trails. If it travels along only the trails that are commonly used by other animals, then it would frequent them, and the physical impact of a 15 to 20 foot tall creature, something taller and possibly wider than an elephant, would be great. It would have a harder time avoiding cameras and both the detection of those cameras and of any people in that area. I would also venture to say that the trails they would create would also be visible from air. Drone users would probably draw attention to such trails, and people would force the creatures to create new trails. It could very well die from exhaustion from this, and its impact would be very, very noticeable. Body heat, a limiting factor. This may seem counterintuitive to the point about Bergmann's rule, but it must be said that the forests of North America aren't always cold. In fact, many places can get quite hot in summer. An 8-foot-tall Bigfoot can deal with the heat by staying in the shade and going into the water for a temporary dip. But a 13 to 20-foot-tall Bigfoot is much more restricted by biological constraints. According to the Public Library of Science on physics.org, in an article titled, Large Animals Travel More Slowly Because They Can't Keep Cool, Find Study, quote, whether an animal is flying, running, or swimming, its traveling speed is limited by how effectively it sheds the excess heat generated by its muscles, according to a new study led by Alexander Dyer from the German Center for Integrative Biodiversity Research, IDIV, and the Friedrich Schiller University, Jena, Germany, published April 18th in the open access journal PLOS Biology. An animal's capacity to travel is a crucial part of its survival and dictates where, and how far, it can migrate, find food and mates, and spread into new territories. This becomes even more challenging in a human-dominated world characterized by increasingly fragmented habitats and limited food and water resources. Dyer and his colleagues developed a model to look at the relationship between animal size and traveling speed, using data from 532 species. While larger animals should be able to travel faster due to their longer wings, legs, or tails, the researchers found that medium-sized animals typically have the fastest sustained speeds. The researchers attribute this to the fact that larger animals require more time to dissipate the heat that their muscles produce while moving, and therefore they must travel more slowly to avoid overheating. They conclude that any animal's traveling speed can be explained by jointly considering how efficiently it uses energy and sheds heat. The new study provides a way to understand animal movement capacities across species and can be used to estimate any animal's traveling speed based on its size, says Dyer. For example, this approach can be applied to predict whether an animal might be able to move between habitats fragmented by human development, even when the details of its biology are unknown. In a web article posted by Eastern Illinois University in a, quote, adapted and amended, end quote, text from Robert Bacher's book, The Dinosaur Heresies, said something along these lines. Now, it was not well adapted, so I'm not quoting per se, but rather reading off the basic information relayed in the article. The symbols rather than words and janky editing was a little much, but it's clearly quite old. So I adapted it myself and tried to clarify everything. So take it with an ounce of salt, but here we go. Said that all through the animal kingdom, the production of body heat drops in a very regular way as body size increases. But generally, the radiation of heat is less for the large animal. A rabbit weighs 10,000 pounds less than an elephant. The elephant produces 10 times less heat per pound per hour. The rabbit equals 75 square inches per pound, and the elephant equals 3.4 square inches per pound. So the elephant has 22 times less skin per pound. In summary, compared to the rabbit, the elephant per pound produces 10 times less heat per pound, but has 22 times less skin area per pound through which it can lose body heat. So even though it produces less heat, it loses much less heat and is always warmer. The rabbit equals 3.7 calories per square inch, and the elephant equals 8 calories per square inch. So the elephant produces 2.2 times more heat per square inch of skin retained. I can imagine that an elephant can handle the heat better than a 13, let alone 15 or 20 foot tall, very hairy Sasquatch. Not only is it harder to find shade at those larger sizes, but moving to new locations could be hard to do. It's one thing for a 7 to 8 foot tall Sasquatch to be able to move around in the heat, but it's another for a massive being, especially without being spotted by people who are out hiking in the summer season. If they walk up on where it's hiding, it would have to get up and move away or try to hide. Being so massive, hiding could work, but moving would probably be best. However, it wouldn't be able to do that easily. Now, to play the devil's advocate, I should point out that on the hottest days, most people stay indoors. And there is some interesting info from a copy of Haviland's 10th edition of Anthropology, which was discussing the idea of bipedality and hair loss in hominins, such as the Australopithecines. Pete Wheeler, a physiologist at Liverpool John Moores University in England, via some experiments, found that, quote, a quadrupedal stance would have exposed the hominin to about 80% more solar radiation than a bipedal one. Not only does a biped expose less of its body to the sun, it also exposes more of its body to the cooler breezes a few feet above ground. The bottom line, says Wheeler, is that on a typical savanna day, a knuckle-walking, chimp-sized hominin would require something in the region of 5 pints of water a day, whereas simply by standing upright, you cut that to something like 3 pints. In addition to that, you can also remain out in the open away from shade for longer, and at higher temperatures. So for an animal that was foraging for scattered resources in these habitats, bipedalism is really an excellent mode of locomotion. Now I do feel that any benefits that bipedality provides cancels out what I pointed out earlier. I feel there is a limit to how big a Bigfoot would reasonably get. And there are many limiting factors a Sasquatch would encounter. The high levels of body heat that they would encounter in 80, 90, and 100 degree Fahrenheit temperatures, even when resting, would be too much. Any of these proposed large Sasquatches would likely die from those temperatures. Alright guys, I had to get Ushi out of here because she was getting a little nervous. She kept licking her doggy bed, kept trying to lick me, wouldn't let me read. I love her so much, but she was very distracting. So I have brought in my other lovely assistant, Ylvis. Say hi, Ylvis. That's all you're gonna get. Okay. He's a very chunky baby. Yeah, isn't that true? Yeah. Yeah, he's a good boy. Yeah, I love him. All right. So, let's proceed, shall we? No animal that big would go unnoticed. Now, a point I've had people bring out to me before, because like I said, that one reel had 3-point-something million views and another has over 400,000 views, is that there are countless big creatures that could exist out there that we just don't know of. People will say that world record moose or brown bears must exist out in the forests and we just don't know about them. Or say that massive creatures have been hard to find in the ocean and that the ocean is still fairly unexplored and such. Now, I can see where people are coming from, but there are some faults with that logic, and one of the biggest is that those world record animals that we don't know of are still from recorded animal species. We know what they look like, we know that they exist, and we've proven it. They are well documented, and the ocean is very different from forests. One is a terrain that is rough but explorable, that being the forests. One is a terrain that is rough but explorable, and the other we have to fight our way through and risk death every single time we try it. So yes, sure, the forests of North America are daunting and rough, but it's not even close to the same as oceans. So it's very much an apples to oranges comparison. Plus, it's easier for life to grow to even very large sizes in water. It's a different medium than air entirely and makes the larger sizes more attainable. On land, food and gravity are two big restrictions that are harder to fight. Drones, planes, and helicopters would all be able to see these massive Sasquatch. In this size comparison, with myself in the frame, you can see just how big the 20-foot tall Sasquatch is. This was a picture my dad took for me out in the forest where we are going to be hunting this year, and you can see just how huge that thing is. Now, to be fair, the 13-foot tall Sasquatch would theoretically be easier to conceal, but combined with the aforementioned points and the next point about the lack of bones or skeletal evidence, I still don't think they exist. So let's move on to those next few points, shall we? The lack of skeletal evidence and what it means. Now, many times in this field, you will hear people ask, where are the bones? And that is one of the best and biggest questions that the skeptical side of this equation always brings up, and for a good reason. Now, I have posited that Bigfoot are the direct descendants of Homo erectus. Now, this makes sense when you think of the lack of eDNA, because it would register as human, theoretically, and the fact that a lack of bones could actually be because they're confused for being our bones by those who lack a distinguished eye. Now, this could not happen if the creature has a head bigger than your torso. All those bones would not degrade quickly at all. Rodents would not have much of an impact, and really all it takes is one large tooth that looks weird, or perhaps one large jawbone, or one massive leg bone, or one gigantic pelvis for the species to be discovered. And, people will say, well, they're just in really remote areas. But like I said, a lot of those remote areas do not have the amount of food necessary to support such a big creature. So, really you can't explain it away very easily. However, when you compare that to the existence of a 6, maybe 6.5 foot for the female Sasquatch, or lower end of the spectrum for male Sasquatch, all the way up to perhaps 8 feet in height, tall Bigfoot, and their bones, they may pass inspection. I highly doubt that you would be finding any of these bones in one large pile. Scavengers do spread them around, and the bones that are there may be gnawed on, may be broken, could be any number of things, but you would find a few bones, but those that you find would still be within the size range that you would find for a human being, and we'll get into that in a second. But I don't feel like it would be likely that you'd find a whole Bigfoot, or especially one that would still be fully haired, that would be freshly dead. I mean, the likelihood of finding a live Sasquatch is fairly low, but finding a dead one would probably be even lower. So, if you did find one that had recently died, it would probably be because of a wildfire. And here we've had some very large wildfires. There's been some very nasty ones that have been started up recently. So, the wildfires are definitely on the mind right now. But even then, with a wildfire, it could very well be all burnt to a crisp, because for a Bigfoot to be caught in the wildfire, it would likely be cornered in an area where the heat is really high, they can't get out, they can't escape. And so at that point, for the wildfire to consume it, it would consume the creature. I don't think it would be like small animals that might try and run out of their den and then they can't find their way back into the den again. It would be one of those situations where if they smell that wildfire coming, they get out of Dodge. And if they can't, and they're surrounded by the fire, and it just engulfs them, I mean, you can't really expect the body to be found whole without there being a lot of singeing and burning that happened. Without trying to be too explicit, I mean, it does need to be kind of put out there. You would not find a fully haired, relatively intact Sasquatch. You'd be finding one that would be burnt to a crisp. But whether it's massive or, but anyway, in either case, whether you're looking at just some scattered bones or looking at a burnt Sasquatch, unless it's massive or fully haired, the likelihood that someone would look at it and go, Bigfoot, is pretty low. Most people don't even really think about Bigfoot. In fact, most people I've talked to act like the idea of Bigfoot never really occurred to them. And they almost always say, I guess I'm a bit of a skeptic, and they'll follow that up with a reason that they thought of as to why. I just kind of have a hard time imagining that they'd be able to evade, our cameras and IR and stuff. I heard someone say that recently. Or they'll go, well, I think it's just probably misidentifications of, bears or elk or something. And I appreciate them trying to reason through it instead of just going, oh, yes, and just latching onto it like a lamprey without any thought or consideration at all. It's good to be skeptical. I will say that for the IR part, there's a lot to that. I'm going to be working on a second video on that topic. I already did one about trail cameras and just the faults of trail cameras. They aren't perfect, right? Everyone kind of looks at trail cams and go, oh, well, they're probably really good. No, they're not bad. Don't get me wrong. I like trail cameras. I've set up quite a few. I'll continue to buy them because I'm a little bit of a collector. I'm also starting up a new review page for them on YouTube that will be called Trail Cam Corner. But basically, there's a lot of faults of trail cameras. A lot of people will look at the advertising and go, oh, well, that's got to be great. And they fail to look at the realistic expectations for that camera and real-world performance. It's kind of like with drug companies. People will just listen to the manufacturer instead of going, well, it's man-made, so there's going to be faults. How does it actually react in the environment that it's going to be used in for a drug in the body, for a camera out in nature? What are all the different little faults that it could have, going over the strengths and weaknesses? People like to just look at the advertising, and the advertising will always look nice. There are a lot of cameras that advertise 32 megapixel photos, but in reality, the sensor has a maximum of 3 megapixels. Right? What do? They interpolate the photo, which means they basically just artificially stretch out the photo to make it even larger, filling up your SD card unnecessarily. The pixels will get a little blurrier. They're harder to see. But of course, people will want to go for the 32 megapixel count because that sounds great, when in reality, it's just an advertising gimmick. And that's just one example. A lot of sensors don't even reach out very far. Trail camera companies will put a advertised distance for the IR light, how far it will reach, and you'll interpret that as going, oh, well, it will sense motion out to 100 feet. No, it's just the IR light. The motion sensor will only pick up out to maybe 60 feet on average. Some cameras do 100 feet, and I just got a camera that goes out past 200 feet, which is fantastic, the VooPeak TC21. I love that camera so far, but in that case, it's a very noticeable camera. It doesn't really blend in well. I think I can do a lot to help it blend in, but it's not great. But anyway, the point is that, I can respect the first one a lot because that I can see where they're coming from. That is a very good question, and I am working on a explanation to that that's much more thorough. But I did already come out with one video that just talks about the limitations of trail cameras, and I recommend you check that out. A lot of people will just go la 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 la. You're just trying to make excuses. La 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 la. It's like, hey, no. Hear me out before you try and claim that, okay? I've seen some cynics that want to throw out the word special pleading a lot and want to throw out the word excuses rather than actually hearing you out. And they have no experience in this area, but because you do, you must be wrong. Or because you claim you do, oh, well, you've got to be a liar. It's like, good Lord, people. I just want people to be balanced. But anyway, the point is that there's also a lot of problems with the misidentifications argument because elk and bears look nothing like Bigfoot, but I can see where people are coming from with that, and it does hold a few little grains of truth. But, most people, are naturally skeptical of such an idea, and that's good. But in a case like this, is someone going to, say a medical examiner comes in to look at the bones, okay, a qualified professional in his field, he looks at the bones. Is he going to go, oh, it's got to be Bigfoot? Or is he going to look at it and go, well, they don't look like the bones of an elk. They're very much human-shaped. They're pretty large, but they're within the range of a human. Yeah, that's got to be a human. Yeah, how about that? He would respond with the latter, wouldn't he? No one that has their career to think of along with their reputation would naturally or immediately want to jump to the idea of Bigfoot, especially when most people just think of Jack Link's commercials and these horrible hoaxes that go around on the internet that are so clearly fake. It is laughable. So no one who's a qualified expert would look at these bones, want to jump up and down and go, Bigfoot, Bigfoot, Bigfoot. Right? It's not a response that you would see. If any of you are medical examiners and you have investigated bones, it kind of made you wonder. Let me know. I'd like to hear. But, at the end of the day, most people don't even think about Bigfoot, nor would someone in that kind of position want to think about Bigfoot at all. So it would naturally make sense that Bigfoot bones would go unnoticed if they blend in with our own. If you're looking at a Gigantopithecus, massive skull, looks nothing like our own, looks nothing like anything else in the environment, you'd have to look at that and go, okay, how the hell do you ignore this, right? It doesn't make sense. The DNA does not match at all. The teeth don't really match. But a squarely human relative with features that are squarely within the range of what we find for Homo sapiens, okay, yes, that makes sense. Now, some will jump up and go, oh, government conspiracy, that's why we don't find bones. Now, I can understand why they say that, especially when you see all the information guys like Dane Wigington has exposed with geoengineeringwatch.org and other exposés that people like James O'Keefe have made about the government. There are some critics of these guys, but for the most part, it seems like they do a very good job. And with James O'Keefe especially, because I've been keeping up with his stuff more, he records these government officials themselves talking about what they have found, and they think that they aren't being recorded, and so they just spill the beans on anything. So, when you see how government officials inside the White House, inside the FBI, inside of, the all these different departments, really, because he's done a lot, all have two faces, the one that the public sees and then the one that they have in private, and openly acknowledge the fact that they have lied to the American people and to the world as a whole. It's easy to go, well, what else are they lying about? It's a natural thing to jump to. And I understand with those topics, but when it comes to Bigfoot, it's a lot more iffy because the whole topic is kind of a speculative, conjecture-filled topic. There's not a whole lot of fact that you can find with Bigfoot at this time. And so jumping to the label of government conspiracy is just a little bit too much for me. I approach all of it with caution, even mentioning those names right here I'm mentioning with caution. But, looking at them for yourself, come up with your own opinions, not someone else's. Because otherwise, you're basically following the model of any cult member. They just let someone else do all the thinking for them, and that's not good. It's really hurt people throughout history, actually, following that model. Now, I will say this. Government conspiracies, or, the government covering up Bigfoot and it being a big conspiracy, would only make sense if they are really, truly related to us, however distantly. But this explanation is one that would only make sense if it's viewed through a modern lens. News about a type of native people being affected by logging and mining, no matter how responsibly operated, would make waves in this day and age. But 100 years ago? 200 years ago? No. So a government cover-up only goes oh so far. And I do not believe that Fish and Wildlife, nor the Forest Service or Park Service, Parks Department, would be the most technologically advanced and would know intimate knowledge about Bigfoot if people who are really dedicated to trying to find info can't find much at all themselves. But there are people like Chanel Barrett, I hope I'm saying her name right, of Bigfoot Bites on YouTube and Instagram, who believe that the Park Service has stolen about $12 billion and has used the parks and forests as basically testing grounds to test weaponry, and are using Bigfoot to, scare people out of the forests. She believes that Bigfoot is largely, if not entirely, a hoax, if I understand her correctly, and that it's used to scare people out of these areas. And to her credit, as soon as she started sharing that kind of info, someone did try to cut her brakes and vandalize her truck. They weren't successful in cutting the brakes. They cut the brake wire, but still could have caused an accident. So, it does seem like there's something to that, potentially. It could be a coincidence, but probably wasn't. Rarely is anything a coincidence when it comes to people attacking your car. There's usually something that went on there. You just broke up with somebody, something, right? There's always some sort of catalyst for that. Now, I do have my doubts about some of those claims, specifically the weapons testing and hoaxing of Bigfoot occurring, at least on a large scale. But who's to say? I can see the dogmen being entirely fabricated, because that is a scary creature, and it has started to really erupt within recent years. There's a lot of reports coming out these days, and with how terrifying the reports are, I can see it. I don't research the topic, though, to be fair. All right, I'm running out on space on my SD card. I'm going to switch it out real quick. Be right back. All right, so I just switched out the card, so I'm back. But anyway, I do see, just kind of getting back on topic here, I do see a lack of understanding or expertise in examining Bigfoot remains as being the most logical explanation. Any dental records that would be done, or taking the dental impressions of the skull, or taking the teeth, any of them that are found, if there's only a few, taking them and comparing dental records with the impressions and trying to see if there's a match would come back as unknown. The DNA test that could occur, and I say could on purpose, would not likely do much to identify it, and that's if they do the DNA tests, because that is expensive, but perhaps they will. It has happened in the past with unidentified remains. It would probably just come back as unknown. It would just be a John Doe, basically. Now, if a forensic anthropologist or a biological anthropologist, I'm going to be interviewing a biological anthropologist soon, by the way, so that'll be very interesting. He's a gentleman that my mom knew when she worked at the University of Idaho, and he's also someone that knew Dr. Grover Krantz, so that will be a very interesting interview. He's skeptical when it comes to Bigfoot, but he's a very nice man, so I'm looking forward to meeting him and being able to talk with him. But anyway, the idea, though, of a forensic anthropologist or biological anthropologist coming in to examine the remains would be one of those situations where you would go, no. However, I will say this. I want to get his opinion on this as well, but for me, I can easily see how ego would come in and how bias could come in here. And I'm not saying that to be insulting, I'm saying it to be just honest. If you are looking at bones that are clearly not very old, say they're less than 200 years old, or they're actually pretty recent, right? Only a few years old. No hair, no skin, it's just bones, but, they, like this jawbone here, right? I found this guy. It's not terribly old. It has a little bit of gnawing on it, but it's not terribly old. I found that out in the woods, lying on the ground. If something like that is found, where it's clearly not more than 5 years of age, but it starts to kind of look like Homo erectus to you, even if you have the qualifications to say, hey, this kind of looks like a Homo erectus, you'd look around and go, well, clearly they aren't here. We don't live next to Homo erectus. Look at how many people say that about Bigfoot. Well, clearly we don't have evidence of them. So any evidence that comes forward must be fake, right? If it's not really a humdinger. But even when you're looking at bones and you're thinking of what Homo erectus was like, you've seen no stone tools, you've seen no evidence of fire that would correlate with Homo erectus in the United States or in Canada that we know of, right? I've found a few that kind of look like something, but that professor that I was telling you about said that no, that's actually Native American as far as the bones. And the stone tools were made by students because it's in an area where a lot of students will come to, practice making stone tools. And so the stone tools that I thought were maybe evidence of Homo erectus were in fact not. So, you're looking at a situation where anything that could be pointed to as possibly Homo erectus is probably not. There's nothing really that goes, hey, what's this? Even with the Cerruti mastodon site, it's really not much of anything. I mean, there's people going, well, it was probably done by accidental damage from the machinery in the area that uncovered it or something. And, oh, well, it was just a natural phenomenon, right? There's a lot of people that look at it and go, I don't think that was made by ancient humans. It doesn't look like it to them. So looking at the amount of data, or actually the lack of data for Homo erectus existing or anything like it, Heidelbergiensis, things like that. If you find a bone that looks like it could be that of a Homo erectus, but it's fairly well preserved and it's young, you look around and go, well, clearly it can't be because they don't exist here. This isn't a Homo erectus bone. It can't be, right? So, even when you have someone that's an expert, I see a very high likelihood of it just being set aside, disregarded, because, it's one thing if it's an old bone that's found and they go, hey, wait a minute, what if they went extinct here, but they did exist? It's another thing to find something that suggests that something is existing with us right now, but you look around and there's absolutely nothing to suggest it, and actually there's people who say that there's evidence to say that they don't exist. So any bones would have to be set aside, right? It just makes sense to me if you're looking at the natural thought process people would go through. Well, yes, but it can't be, right? So, any remains of something 6 to maybe 8 feet in height would blend in. I really see that as being true. Unless you see a fully formed skull that is just a hell of a humdinger, because a Homo erectus skull does look a little different from a Homo sapiens skull. Even then, the jawbones are similar, the craniums are fairly similar, especially if they've been here for long enough to where their facial features have evolved a little bit. Look into the founder, is it syndrome? The founder effect, where basically the genetic pool being fairly concentrated in one area will shape how the people in that area look. And so certain features will become more pronounced, others may disappear. It's just fascinating. But, people have described Bigfoot's face as being less pronounced, and more of a flat face, like us. So perhaps their faces evolved in a similar manner as ours, or maybe not. It's completely theoretical. But I do see any human remains being found, any Bigfoot remains being found, just being labeled as that of a John Doe, and just being labeled as a human. So, before you point out that, oh, well, that's still quite a, tall height, 8 feet, no, that wouldn't blend in. Well, let's look at the documented existence of a man by the name of Angus McGaskill. Okay, he was a true giant who stood at 7 feet 9 inches in height, and it was not due to a birth defect. There are people on the record that have been huge, and so any forensic examiner or medical examiner would have to know that, and know that, okay, so even though this is kind of a large tooth or a large jawbone or a large skull even maybe, or a large leg bone, you name it, it's still within the range of possibility for a human. It has to be a human, because clearly it isn't an elk. So hopefully that makes sense. Let's move on. The amount of poop a Sasquatch would create and what it means. Now this is a pretty crappy topic, but we're going to talk about it anyway. I continually hear people bring up this question of, where's the poop? If Bigfoot are real, then there should be scat that can be attributable to Bigfoot. And this makes sense if you're looking at a massive Bigfoot, but for a smaller one, I don't see it. The question of where's the bones and where the pictures of Bigfoot are at the top. Right? Those are serious questions, right? If you're looking at a pyramid, those are at the very, very top of that pyramid. But this one is a couple levels down because it's really not as big a deal as people think it is, in my eyes. Now, I will say this. I can see it being an issue if they are either A, largely a vegetarian, or B, very large creatures. Now, let's explain what I mean by that. I've felt for a long time that they are largely carnivores, as carnivores typically don't produce much fecal matter. And what they do produce isn't as smelly, and it's usually just filled with hair. Carnivore poop just does not stink like herbivore poop does. It just does not. When you're only eating meat, you aren't going to have a lot of smell attributed to it. At least if your body is well adjusted to it, you have good gut bacteria that helps digest it well and helps digest it efficiently. I have not known many people who were carnivores or seen many animals that were carnivores that just stank to high heaven. Let's be honest here. Herbivores, you go to the zoo and you go see the hippos, or if you have a farm and you go see the pigs, I mean, let's be honest here, they reek to high heaven. And so, I'm not going to go down that path much longer, but just telling you, there's a big difference between the stench of one party versus the other when it comes to the diet. Now, I will say this. Right? It may not be possible for Bigfoot to be purely carnivorous, okay? I do think that they would be opportunists, eating any apples or pears, insects or whatnot that is available, right? It just makes sense. I think they're primarily carnivorous, but they are technically omnivores. Omnivores that lean towards being carnivores, right? If that makes sense, hopefully. Hopefully it does. But any fecal matter that would be produced, here's the point, would be awfully similar to both human and bear poop. How many people are bagging up any pile of poop that they see out in the woods and wanting to send it into the Smithsonian or something to have it examined? I remember hearing someone say that, they knew that there were people that sent in poop that they found out in the woods that looked to be maybe Bigfoot poop when the Patterson-Gimlin footage came out. But even then, I seem to remember no one really had a good way of testing it. So they just saw what was in there and went, well, that's probably bear poop. Done. So, a creature far larger than 8 feet in height would be much bigger than most bears and does not have much of an excuse for its fecal matter to not be identified. The poop would be massive. It would, in effect, stand out. You would see it and wonder just what made it, and that would gather attention. At the very least, I would make the local news or something. Something that big would not just affect the environment with how much it eats, but also with how much waste it produces.
That is one big pile of shit.
The waste of animals in an area helps fuel the forest. It puts, I want to say nitrogen, back into the soil, correct me if I'm wrong, but it helps plant life flourish. There's a back and forth there. There's always a give and take with everything in the area, and the poop that animals drop will help the insect life. If there's dung beetles and stuff, it will help the fungi and the dirt and the plants. And so you'll see evidence of where animals have been living, in effect, from the poop that they create going back into the ground and fueling the plant life that's there. I know from being out in forestry lands where cows have been, I mean, good God, I mean, even when it's just one pile of poop, you see it. And when there's a whole bunch of cows in an area, I mean, the whole area is just littered with it. You see it. It stands out, and it smells bad, too. Maybe not bad, per se, but you can smell it. The size of their feet. Now, the name Bigfoot is pretty self-descriptive. After all, the name originated from the press nicknaming the track famously presented by Jerry Crew, a cast that measured 16 by 7 inches, which he brought to the Humboldt Times office in 1958. The simple fact is that Bigfoot have a foot that's well adapted to their environment and their stature. It allows them to support their body weight while keeping their pressure on the ground proportional to that of a human being, or an average human being. And it's possible that Bigfoot have larger feet than most assume. The snowshoe-like effect the feet would have would go up a little if the largest prints that have been found didn't belong to a 9 to 10 foot tall Sasquatch, but rather one that was 8 to maybe 8.5 feet tall instead. What I do know is this. 22-inch long footprints have been found, and if compared to Robert Wadlow, then using Dr. Krantz's estimates of a Bigfoot having a foot 23% larger than a man of the same stature, we find that the Bigfoot in question was actually slightly shorter than Mr. Wadlow's height of 8'11". Now, this isn't perfect, as foot size is hardly consistent, but the basic point is that such large feet are not necessarily going to correlate to a massive 11-plus foot tall Bigfoot. In fact, according to livestrong.com, quote, the normal height to foot ratio is about 6.6 to 1, according to data from the University of Rhode Island Department of Electrical, Computer, and Biomechanical Engineering. That means you'll generally have roughly 6.6 inches of height for 1 inch of foot length. So if we figure out the height of a Bigfoot at 8 feet, or 96 inches, then a human male would have a foot approximately 14.6 inches long. Add the 23% increase and it adds up to 17.958 inches, or almost 18 inches for the male Sasquatch. And here's the metric conversion on the screen. I also forgot to put it here. In most substrates, footprints cannot be found, and this is an important point that I've actually heard some skeptics bring out. That, why are all these footprints showing up when, in most cases, the Bigfoot's foot should be large enough to not even leave an imprint, especially on most substrates, right? Why are you finding so many footprints, Paul Freeman? Well, for one thing, he did admit to hoaxing in one case, according to a gentleman that was there at the time. The sheriff's department was called in on the scene of one of his, encounters, and they were looking at the scene. They realized that nothing had happened, and they cornered him and said, "Hey, why are you hoaxing this?" And he admitted that he had faked the footprints and faked the sighting, but he supposedly did have a sighting earlier on in his life, and that's why he hoaxed this stuff, was to essentially get people to believe him. And that's a horrible idea if he was telling the truth, because effectively you have to throw everything he found out the window, or you have to take it with a grain of salt at the very least. And so it's just, if you can't find good evidence, then don't take bad evidence and try and present it as good evidence. Bad evidence will forever be bad evidence. It will never be good evidence. You cannot edit it to make it good evidence. It is bad evidence. And so that's something that I was really bummed out to hear about, but I did see in that fellow's book why he felt like Paul Freeman could not be trusted with anything he created. That makes sense. And no wonder Renee Hinden felt so strongly about that topic, which is rather sad, honestly, that Paul Freeman even felt like he had the hoax, if he's telling the truth about his prior sightings. But if he lied once, what stops him from lying again? Right? It's that same principle that we mentioned earlier. It throws everything for a loop, doesn't it? So just kind of keep that in mind, folks. But again, in most substrates, footprints cannot be found. It's only in muddy ground or soft, sandy, silty type material that footprints can be preserved. And that's if they last, as they don't stay complete for long. Wind, rain, and other foot traffic will work to destroy the tracks and imprints. But if we try to estimate the foot size of these two size estimates, the 13-footer and the 20-footer, then this is what we get. So the way I went about it is I took 6.6 and times it by 23.6 to get something close to the initial number there, the length of 13 feet. It came out to 155.76 inches. So taking 23.6 and adding in 23%, you get a 29.028 inch long foot. So for a 13-foot tall Bigfoot, it would basically have a 29-inch long foot, okay? I'm sorry I'm having a hard time reading this. I'm starting to get a little bit of a sore throat from all the talking. So calculating the 20-footer, it has a 20 feet is 240 inches. Taking 6.6 and timesing it by 36.6, we get 241.56. It's not quite the right amount, but very close. So just taking that 36.6 and adding 23%, you get 45.018 for a basically 45-inch long foot. Now that's me trying to add it all together. Again, I'm bad at math, so I tried to just use the estimations I had available and just trying to figure out what's closest. So, if you have a more precise way of figuring out the estimates, because again, 241.56 is not the same as 240, but basically a 20-foot tall Bigfoot could be just slightly taller, and that would work. I'm not the best at math, so forgive me for my errors. I try to do the best job I can. But if we just take those numbers, 29-inch long foot and a 45-inch long foot, for the 13-footer and 20-footer, I mean, that's pretty big. Now, according to Dr. Krantz, quote, in both species, human and Sasquatch, the increasing area of the sole fails to keep up with the more rapidly increasing body weight. Compared with our 5-foot 8-inch athlete, a 6-foot 6-inch man presses down with 15% more weight per unit area, while the typical female Sasquatch at that height presses down the same 15% harder. At 7 feet 8 inches, a man presses 35% harder than our standard athlete, and the same size Sasquatch also presses 35% harder. This would be a typical male of the species. Moving up to 8 feet 2 inches, a man would press 44% harder than our athlete, and the very large Sasquatch likewise presses 44% harder. It appears that there is a limiting factor of just half again times the relative foot pressure of a normal-sized man versus the largest likely Sasquatch. In order to double the weight on a given area of foot surface, the Sasquatch would have to be 11 feet 4 inches tall, or 3.45 meters, and would probably weigh 2,650 pounds, or 1,205 kilograms. The failure of increasing foot size to keep up with increasing body weight will put limits on how big a Sasquatch can get. Compression of the skin and fat of the sole increases toward the theoretical limit of half again greater, but this is not a serious problem within the presumed size range. Human body weight is transmitted to the ground through no more than 25% of the sole area. Redesigning the Sasquatch foot to increase that support area to 38% of the sole would easily handle that problem. The flat arch alone may accomplish most of this redesign. More serious is the tendency for increasing weight to impress the foot ever more deeply into the ground. I would think that as the limiting factor of half again human is approached, their ability to walk on many kinds of substrates will be seriously impeded. It's not likely that the feet can be made any larger in relation to stature without introducing major walking problems. So Dr. Krantz is right. The idea that a Bigfoot would not suffer issues with height and weight increase is just not true. It would suffer issues, just like he said. But even if the points that Dr. Krantz made are set aside, you just ignore those. The fact is that a 7 to 8 foot tall Bigfoot's tracks are consistently claimed to be double-step bear tracks. That would naturally, if Bigfoot really do exist, mean that a fair amount of people have found their tracks but set them aside, reasoning that they aren't the tracks of a humanoid being, but rather those of a bear. This is assuming that the creature would be leaving many tracks, as again, many substrates don't allow tracks to be formed. But the damage to branches, logs, and ferns that a 45-inch foot or even just a 29-inch foot would make would be harder to ignore. It could go ignored though, but traffic on sand and soft dirt? No excuses could be made for that except it being a hoax, but even then people will want to talk about it. And like I said, the media would be called in and it would be quite an event. The Mammoth Mastodon Sasquatch Connection. In my eyes, there are a lot of connections between mammoths, mastodons, and Sasquatch. Now, I will be quoting a lot of information here, so we'll see how this goes, but I think this is quite interesting. So let's start off by looking at Paleoxodon nematicus. According to iNaturalist.ca, quote, estimated to be 4.35 meters tall compared to a human, Paleoxodon nematicus is the largest species in the genus Paleoxodon and is one of the largest known proboscideans and is considerably larger than living elephants. Also, I hope I'm pronouncing everything correctly. A 2015 study by Azier Larramendi attempted to estimate the size of P. nematicus, as well as other prehistoric proboscideans, based on a fragmentary skeleton of an adult male, comprising 2 femurs, the left one of which was measured to be around 1.6 meters or 5.2 feet in length when excavated in 1834, a left ulna and a right humerus from Sagawani and Narsinghpur district, Madhya Pradesh. Larramendi extrapolated a shoulder height of 4.35 meters or 14.3 feet and a weight of 13 tons or 29,000 pounds for this individual. A fragmentary lower portion of a femur described in 1834 in the same publication that described the femurs of the Sagawani specimen stated that this femur was almost a quarter larger than that from Sagawani. Assuming that it was about 20% larger, Larramendi calculated an extrapolated femur length of 1.9 meters or 6.2 feet and a speculative size estimate of 5.2 meters or 17.1 feet tall at the shoulder and 22 tons or 49,000 pounds in body mass, which, if correct, would make P. nematicus probably the largest land mammal ever, exceeding even Paracerathers in size. However, this estimate should be taken with a grain of salt, as Larramendi stated that he could not locate the specimen, but speculated that it may be stored in the Indian Museum of Kolkata. In 2023, a publication by Gregory S. Paul and Larramendi estimated that another specimen identified as CF P. nematicus, also only known from a partial femur, would have weighed 18 to 19 tons, or 40,000 to 42,000 pounds. Other authors have noted that weight estimates for proboscideans based on single bones can lead to estimates that are highly improbable, compared to accurate estimates from complete skeletons. In 2024, Biswas, Cheng, and Tsai estimated a maximum shoulder height of over 4.5 meters or 15 feet, and suggested that the body mass for 5 measured specimens ranged from 13.2 to 18.5 tons, or 29,000 to 41,000 pounds. So that was a lot. That was a, a tongue twister of some of those names, but hopefully I did it justice. Moving on, according to the Natural History Museum, quote, originating on the African continent, ancient DNA now suggests that Paleoxodon is most closely related to the living African elephants. Over the last million years, the ancient elephants spread as far east as Japan, across Europe, and as far north as the UK. In fact, remains of straight-tusked elephants have even been found beneath Trafalgar Square in London. While those that inhabited the mainland remain massive, some animals made it onto a number of islands scattered throughout the Mediterranean. Isolated from the rest of the Paleoxodon populations on small islands, these elephants underwent what is known as island dwarfism to become miniature species of elephant. The animals would have been living in a world vastly different to today. When they dispersed out of Africa, Paleoxodon would have encountered an environment enswayed to the huge ice sheets that capped the northern hemisphere, and a continent already populated with elephants more familiar to the cooler climate, mammoths. It's really interesting, explained Stephen, because in Africa, Paleoxodon is one of the classic indicator fossils of arid savannas with very few trees, like what we see in East Africa today. But we know from tooth wear that once they got to Europe, they seem to have changed diet from grazing animals into browsing ones. This was probably to avoid competition with grazing mammoths, as mammoths migrated into Eurasia at least 2 million years before Paleoxodon did. Now this is interesting. Because of the warm environment, mammoths and mastodons were actually quite possibly larger than any of their cold weather relatives in either species. According to A to Z Animals, quote, Paleoxodon pneumaticus lived in Asia from the early to mid-Pleistocene. The animal had a widespread distribution. Their range extended from the Indian subcontinent all the way to Japan. In places where they're found, this Paleoxodon species lived in temperate wooded habitats. So now let us note elephants as well. According to the World Wildlife Fund, there are two species of African elephants, the savanna or bush elephant and the forest elephant. Savanna elephants are larger than forest elephants, and their tusks curve outwards. In addition to being smaller, forest elephants are darker, and their tusks are straighter and point downward. There are also differences in the size and shape of the skull and skeleton between the two species. Forest elephants are uniquely adapted to the dense forest habitat of the Congo Basin. So that's interesting, and now with the next piece of information, you'll see why that comes in handy, because again, the environment dictates the size of these animals. So according to the Encyclopedia Britannica, quote, male bush elephants often grow as tall as 10.5 to 13.1 feet, or 3.2 to 4 meters at the shoulder, and weigh up to between about 9,900 and 13,500 pounds, or 4,500 and 6,100 kilograms, or 5 to 6.7 tons, with the largest known bush elephant weighing 24,000 pounds, or 10,886 kilograms, or 12 tons. So that's the one that lives in more open areas. And what about the forest elephant? Well, it says here, whereas the African forest elephants reach approximately 8 to 10 feet, or 2.4 to 3 meters in height, and can grow up to 3 to 10 feet, or 1 to 3 meters in length. Their approximate weight ranges between 4,000 and 12,000 pounds, 1,800 and 5,400 kilograms, or 3 to 6 tons. So now let's look at mastodons and mammoths. So according to the National Park Service, quote, mastodons and woolly mammoths overlapped in Beringia during the early to mid-Pleistocene, with mastodons thriving in the warmer interglacial periods and mammoths favoring the colder glacial epochs. Mammoths survived in eastern Beringia until about 13,000 years ago, while the very last mammoths in Alaska appear to have survived on the Pribilof Islands until about 6,000 to 8,000 years ago. The very last woolly mammoths lived in northern Siberia on Wrangel Island until about 4,000 years ago. And according to the Encyclopedia Britannica, the woolly mammoth lived in steppe tundra habitat, also called mammoth steppe, an ecosystem made up of low shrubs, sedges, and grasses, which was widespread across Eurasia and North America during the Pleistocene. But there's some evidence that some populations also inhabited forests of the present-day Midwestern United States. The woolly mammoth was herbivorous, consuming the stems and leaves of tundra plants and shrubs. And according to the North Dakota Geological Survey official website, quote, the American mastodon, Mammoth americanum, was one of the most common proboscideans that lived in North America at the end of the Ice Age, but few fossils of these animals have been found in North Dakota. Mastodons were elephant-like and elephant-size, about the size of the Indian elephant that lives today. Many were about 10 feet tall at the shoulder. The heads of these animals were long and held low with long, curved tusks. Like the woolly mammoth that lived in North Dakota at the same time as mastodons, they were covered with long, shaggy hair for insulation against the Ice Age cold. They were browsers and lived in spruce woodlands. Paleo Indians hunted these animals. They became extinct at about the same time as woolly mammoths at the end of the Ice Age, about 10,000 years ago. So again, the environments where these species grew the biggest was not in cold habitats, and the environment terrain had an impact on their body size and shape. Did mammoth species always grow so large? Well, according to the National Park Service, quote, in 1994, paleontologists made the remarkable discovery of a pygmy mammoth on Santa Rosa Island, the most complete collection of its kind in the world. Found only on the California Channel Islands and nowhere else in the world, the pygmy mammoth was probably a small form of the Columbian mammoth found on the mainland. Pygmy mammoths varied from 4.5 to 7 feet high at the shoulders and may have weighed only about 2,000 pounds, compared to the 14-foot tall, 20,000-pound Columbian mammoth. In other respects, they were probably similar, with short fur, a typical mammoth body form, and a relatively large head. The first remains of elephants on Santa Rosa Island were reported in 1873. Additional excavations over the years have given a basic understanding of a population of mammoths on the islands which became smaller in body size through time and which perished as the Pleistocene ended. Paleontological excavations on Santa Rosa Island in 1927 and 1928 resulted in the retrieval of a significant collection of a new species described as Mammuthus exilis. Philip Orr of the Santa Barbara Museum of Natural History recovered additional materials during archaeological and geological work on Santa Rosa Island during the 1940s and 1950s. Remains of mammoths are most common on Santa Rosa and San Miguel Islands, with smaller numbers recovered from Santa Cruz Island and from San Nicolas Island outside the park. The recovered specimens range in size from 4 to 8 feet at the shoulder, compared to the 12 to 14 foot height of mainland mammoths. Approximately 40,000 to 20,000 years ago, a small group of 14-foot tall, 20,000-pound Columbian mammoths embarked on a journey that would eventually end in the development of a new species, the Channel Islands pygmy mammoth. Leaving the heavily grazed mainland behind, these Columbian mammoths swam towards the scents of abundant vegetation from the huge mountainous island of Santa Rosa. Approximately 20,000 years ago, when the sea level was about 300 feet lower than it is today, the four northern islands joined together to form an Ice Age super-island, known as Santa Rosa. This island was only 6 miles from the mainland at its closest distance. As the ice sheets and glaciers melted and the sea level rose, only the highest parts of Santa Rosa remained as modern islands. But how did they reach the island? With their snorkel-like trunk and buoyant mass, elephants, living relatives of mammoths, are considered excellent distance swimmers, among the best of all land mammals, and skilled at crossing water gaps. Documented accounts demonstrate that Asian elephants swim to islands they cannot even see, some up to 23 miles away, guided by the odor of ripening fruit and vegetation. There is no reason that Pleistocene mammoths were not just as seaworthy and just as good at swimming. Once on the island, the population of mammoths increased, and eventually the food supply became scarce as the island decreased in size due to climatic changes, glaciers and ice sheets melting, and sea levels rising. Those mammoths that were smaller and could survive with less food and water were at an advantage, especially in times of seasonal shortages. Over time, smaller animals that required fewer resources became the norm. In addition, the absence of predators on the islands also may have contributed to this downsizing. Large size was no longer needed for predator avoidance and defense. Within less than 20,000 years, natural selection favored smaller-sized mammoths that stood less than 6.5 feet tall at the shoulder, less than half the height of their mainland ancestor. Thus, the small mammoths became a new species, the Channel Islands pygmy mammoth. The pygmy mammoth is an extinct member of an ancient and unique group of mammals, collectively known as proboscideans. The name comes from the Greek word proboscis and refers to the large or extended noses. While the fossil history of this group spans over 55 million years and more than 160 different species, today's elephants are the last survivors of this widespread group of animals. After 200,000 years as one of Earth's most dominant species, mammoths, which once thrived across Europe, Asia, and North America, became extinct nearly 10,000 years ago. The extinction of the mammoths was also part of the much wider phenomenon of disappearance of the world's larger mammals, which started about 40,000 years ago and reached its peak between 12,000 and 10,000 years ago. Just what caused the demise of this Pleistocene megafauna is still unknown. Nearly 30 years of research and testing has not yet provided an answer that is universally convincing. Mammoth finds are by no means rare. Complete skeletons to cave paintings have been discovered on 4 continents in a wide variety of locations. An engraving of a mammoth on mammoth ivory found in a rock shelter in southwestern France, a preserved frozen carcass of a baby male mammoth in the permafrost of Siberia, a sinkhole with more than 100 mammoth remains in Hot Springs, South Dakota, and of course our own mammoth find right here in our backyard, within Channel Islands National Park, the discovery of the world's first virtually complete pygmy mammoth skeleton in 1994. Studying the pygmy mammoth reveals how important the Channel Islands are in illuminating the mysteries of evolution. The isolation of the islands have made them natural laboratories of evolutionary extravagance, as seen not only in the pygmy mammoth, but also in the extinct giant mouse, the diminutive island fox, the munchkin dudleya, and the giant bright blue island jay. Isolated from their mainland relations and exposed to unique environmental conditions, the ancestors of these plants and animals, along with over 70 others, responded by becoming new species unique to the island, found nowhere else on Earth. So that was quite good, although there were a few typos in there that made me kind of stumble. They did a good job on that, and I thought that was fascinating. You know, again, food resources shaped how big they became, along with genetics. And, the environment as a whole really played a large part in that, not just the restricted size, but, food resources. That's the big one, I think, more than anything else. But all that goes right along with the evidence I pointed to earlier about grizzly bears. You can only grow large when you have food resources that enable you to grow and feed yourself effectively. As much of a benefit as large size provides in cold weather, it is a detriment that leads you to death if you cannot sustain that size by finding enough food. So although people claim that a Bigfoot would grow large in the northern environments, if anything, it would shrink in size. As I pointed out in my last video, which was aimed at figuring out if Sasquatch can survive winter, and if so, just how, I feel a height of 7 to 8 feet for an adult male is reasonable, attainable, and most likely. The long legs they potentially have gives them the ability to walk over forest debris more easily than someone my height or shorter. Their bones would blend in if found. Their locomotion would not be hampered as it would be if they were larger. They are less hunted by predators if they are really hunted at all. It gives them the ability to fight back if need be. They don't impact the environment as heavily and noticeably as a much larger Sasquatch would, and whatever else you can think of. The basic point is this. In an environment where you are cramped and have to fight through vegetation to move around, you do not turn into a giant. Rather, your size shrinks to a degree, and your balance point becomes lower. This is the exact opposite of what people claim for Bigfoot. So, that's all I have scripted. I just have to say, folks, that this was a fascinating topic. I didn't realize just how much info I would find on it. So I'm very glad that I posted that reel when I did, and it kind of opened up this can of worms. As you can see, this is the size comparison, again, that I had made originally. Of me just kind of looking up at the kayak, and you can see just how tall those two proposed Bigfoot heights would be. And, that's just massive. It does fit in Cabela's, that 18-footer, but good Lord. And then you can see this size comparison again that Aloe Arts made for me. I'm very proud of it. He did a great job. It was very nice working with him. I can highly recommend him. I'll have a link down below to his page. But again, it's just Aloe Arts on Instagram. As you can see, instead of an 18-footer, we have the 20-footer. And, of course, we have the 13-foot tall Bigfoot, elephant, and then the 8-foot tall Bigfoot. And me, basically, it's 6'2" or so human being. And as you can see there, the 8-footer isn't massive comparatively when you're looking at those other just huge figures. But when you're looking at just the human and the Bigfoot, that is exactly what people report, a big creature. And in fact, it makes a lot more sense for it to be that tall, especially when you factor in that a lot of people describe Bigfoot having very wide shoulders and a small head. Well, I didn't make that as big a detail in this illustration. I didn't really ask for that as much, but if Bigfoot has a smaller head than what a lot of us immediately think of because of Gigantopithecus being such a pervasive theory, and the skull size being a really big deal. Ooh, look at that. If you get rid of that, what you find is that Bigfoot would not likely grow a skull that's much larger than a large human male's skull because the brain is a very difficult thing to fuel. Finding the raw materials to fuel that brain and let it grow that big is difficult. So anything larger than what you'd find for a large human male would not likely exist. We have very large brains per body size comparatively. When you're looking at a lot of animals, we have a fairly large brain, and the resources needed to fuel it and to just allow it to be made in the first place is, quite extensive. There's a lot of nutrients that are needed to fuel the brain and get it to be made. It needs materials, building materials. So a Bigfoot having a brain that is around the same size as that of a large human male makes a lot of sense. Again, for the remains not being found, but also it lines up with the reports that people have made. And it just overall makes biological, rational sense. So it's one of those other little details that I meant to add in there. So please comment your thoughts down below, guys. I look forward to hearing them. My throat is starting to get kind of sore, and I'm going to have to move on with the rest of my day, but I thought I'd take this time to record this. And Ushi and Yolis both say hello, and I hope you guys enjoyed. Again, please like, share, and subscribe. Please comment down below. Feel free to donate to the channel, and thank you all so very much for watching. Bye.